the past years, the Freetown community opened up a world of opportunities seeking to understand the dynamic interactions of city metabolism, its people and their environment. Deepening our analysis of Portee Rokupa and the spatial and temporal characteristics augmenting accumulation of risk cycles, we propose a strategy for transformative action. Studying livelihoods and location in relation with social, environmental, and economical risk cycles allowed us to identify frequency and exposure to different levels of vulnerability interlinked with occupational hazards, particularly within the fishing community. Portee Rokupa was first settled in the early 40s and became a vibrant fishing community as a result of Freetown's economic development. While Portee was the initial settlement, Rokupa was by then a forested area later used by the prisons department. Eventually, settlement's development began due to independence of Sierra Leone from British rule in 1961 and from mass migration from civil war ending 2002. Portee Rokupa is a spatially and demographically diverse area consisting of both formal and informal settlements, facing complexity of risks. Spatially speaking, Portee is a trading area, while Rokupa is a residing area. The geographical characteristics of Portee Rokupa constitutes of steep rocky slopes and cliffs with sandy soil structure, bringing along rocks towards rapidly expanding reclaimed coastal land. While uphill settlements are mainly considered formal due to residents having land tenure, lower settlements are more informally dispersed along the coast with a central intermediary fishing area and trading center. Within the three pre-identified accumulation cycles, we focus on location and livelihoods as key variables undermining environmental risk, services accessibility, and occupational hazard along the fishing value chain. To understand the relation between livelihoods and everyday risks, we undertook transit walks, mapping out the services and landmarks, highlighting differences in accessibility between formal and informal settlements in Portee and Rokupa. These include water access and drainage points, health, religious and community centers, and roads. Higher risk exposure in informal settlements is enhanced by poor waste management, polluting the ocean and affecting the fish yields. Additionally, inefficient water management causes floods, washing away valuable equipment such as woods, nets and boats, ultimately impacting the local economy. Drainage waste blockage, land reclamation, pollution runoff, and natural disaster vulnerability are all identified in our environmental pillar as follows.
Because some people they get out of plenty, they don't get to live for care and go. Once then 10, 11 or 2 o'clock morning. I mean, wake you to be for like take out of the go to anyhow. You go to that. If you are ready to
By mapping the location of environmental risks along the informal settlement, namely floods, mud and landslides and fires, we identified the correlation between services location and the way natural disasters impact their accessibility.
The former councillor, I don't know whether he wrote a project or what, but it was as a result of his intervention that clinic was constructed there. And that's the only service they have here.
To map out occupational hazards identified in our economic cycle, we listed out the full fishing value chain, where many actors engage at different stages. To structure our research, we selected 6 key representatives to interview, namely boat builders, wood sellers, net menders, fisherman crew, fish dryers or smokers, and lastly fish sellers, who are mostly women. The socioeconomic flow connecting these 6 agents results from a mapping exercise showing their living and work conditions and the hazards they incur. Comparing the locations of 6 occupations along the fishing value chain, we mapped the physical injuries, the financial risks, and the outbreaks characterizing each individual, represented in the map by a number from total of 38 interviewees gathered during our focus groups.
What be say if you get a stronger roll where you don't put the fish, once you claim on top, then they go lay that fish. But if it's strong, nothing will happen. But when you're not strong, under that man he can let a time now until they capsize for them.
Like August. You understand? The weather is rough. You understand? Then for who accidents they be there, we now get government now we swear.
Since the level of exposure to risk is dependent on people's differences, not only because of their location but also because of their socioeconomic position along the fishing value chain, the first part of our strategy is about income, assets, and control over those variables. Representing income in terms of money flow, not only we map the difference in wages across occupation, but also the transactions occurring among actors, which are dependent on seasonality, position on the value chain, and input availability. Equipment flows shows the physical transactions occurring along the value chain. People's control over assets does not necessarily translate into lower vulnerability, as they might not be the owners of those. For example, most fishermen rent the boats they make use of, and boat makers also import the wood they need. Once subject to liquidation, assets are transformed into a source of income. The fact we wish to point out is that ownership of those assets is allocated towards the left side of our value chain, while the individuals with the highest source of income are located towards the end flow. Overall, because of those differences in distribution, we have hypothesized that an individual's capacity to cope, mitigate or prevent risks is influenced by their position in the fishing value chain, their geographical exposure to hazards, and access to social capital, explained as follows. To justify the correlation between income, assets, and control highlighted in the first step of our strategy, we overlap the 6 fish agents' routes, starting from where they take their input to where they send their output, to map out the frequency and exposure to environmental and occupational risks, influencing the coping capacities of the different occupations along the fishing value chain. In our findings, fish agents operate during the rainy season, while opting for an alternative source of income during the dry season, such as petty trading and wood charcoal selling. Diversifying their annual source of income allows them, on the one hand, to make use of and access of the wide variety of assets operating over a short period, such as a single season. On the other hand, control over income is subject to unpredictability, as inputs might be either unavailable or output supply exceed demand, leaving the good unsold. As individuals travel long-distance commutes, further raising their daily exposure to environmental risk, remapping risk using this methodology showed that almost 90% of routes overlapped an environmental risk. Because of limited service accessibility and inefficient networks infrastructure, the equipment flow of the fishing value chain is disrupted by displacing occupational activities far away compared to where the agents live, take input from, and send output to. We conducted 2 separate focus groups with a total of 45 residents from Portee and Rokupa, featuring different ages, genders, and occupations within the fishing value chain. The outcome made clear that our proposed strategy, namely individually and collectively, needed to incorporate a dual aspect characterizing control, operating in parallel to increase the capacities to act, mitigate, and prevent risk. In case of an environmental risk, capacity to cope is heavily dependent on an individual's location within the informal settlement, disproportionately affected due to longer travel times and inefficient network infrastructure. Commercial connections expand from Portee Rokupa's wharf to Rokupa Junction and Port Loco. Floods, fire outbreaks, and malaria seems to be the most frequent and severe risks, with little or no coping mechanisms in place. Community mobilization plays a key role in disaster relief to make up for the lack of services accessibility. When asked about the alternative activities in the absence of fishing, fish sellers engage in petty trading outside the fishing community. Fish smoking is a method used to prolong the shelf life of fish that can be sold and consumed later on in less productive seasons. Fish sellers, the wealthiest of the community, tend to informally lend money to other members along the value chain when they incur a financial loss. While borrowing at a lower rate compared to formal microfinance schemes, debtors can still incur extra costs due to the interest. Finally, members of value chain tend to partner with fellow partners of their profession in saving schemes. Our deepened strategy extends from an individual's to the collective methods of risk mitigation, coping, and prevention. Individual methods put emphasis on governance and control over services and infrastructure, looking to enforce accessibility and networks logistics. As part of individual development strategy, we propose the need for improvement in logistics networks and accessibility through road payments in the main slope, linking the fishing district to the upper market. The same area, for instance, might include the construction of a storage center where fuel and safety gear can be stored and bought safely. Additionally, a new health center needs to be allocated around the central fishing area to increase accessibility to emergency services. We also have recognized the urgency for improved artificial and natural drainage, which needs to be cleaned and proactively managed to disrupt the risk traps and alleviate the occupational hazards. A long-term infrastructure plan should integrate these individual per-area projects towards linking Portee to Rokupa, the formal and informal settlement, as well as neighboring fishing districts such as Susan's Bay and Cockle Bay in temporal and spatial discourses.
You understand it? We don't arrest the house, then the other area now we will put other initiative over it. So this one, now the most important one is where this is careless. You know, we don't share them. Where we they go, we save the common area, we go. We go see synonymous of them problem they compare to real now. If they think that they don't be under, it's solved. So I believe the we back with them one, they must solve.
Collective capacity builds on the individual effort as it seeks to efficiently manage the newly established control through sustainable funding mechanisms, specifically microfinance and per-occupation saving groups.
For the small microfinance, they are paying weekly. Yes, they are paying weekly, and the big loan we pay monthly.
What happens if they cannot repay the loan?
Sometimes they will make a contract with a credit officer that is responsible. If you did not pay, members in the group supposed to help you to pay that money. If they cannot, they will give them to the next week.
Microfinance schemes are offered to the community depending on their financial stability and gender. Men mostly make use of informal loans among themselves at little or no interest, a practice whose access availability could be formalized and extended to other members of Portee, Rokupa and other communities.
And first of all, let the microfinance be open to them. Then when they're in the community, they don't get access. So if the microfinance institution then open the door to them for them to get access, that way for improve on their business where they do. Also, we ask them, they say the interest rate for somewhere get a connection, the interest rate very high.
Similarly, the difficulty to access the Emergency Response Fund due to long bureaucracy provided by the government in case of an environmental damage should be facilitated through better information access of such plans to the informal settlements. Finally, per-occupation savings schemes can truly benefit those individuals highly exposed to financial risks, particularly when external conditions limit inputs availability. A successful scheme would make sure everyone contributes to the fund while keeping an eye on those free riders that belong to the same occupation but do not chip in the savings schemes, yet make use of the equipment or loan. In conclusion, our strategy involves, firstly, an individual component focusing on the control over the fishing value chain, where the short-term aims are localized infrastructure improvement extended to a broader network supported by NGOs and CBOs such as the Youth Millennium Organization, Portee Environmental Youth Association, and YMCA. to increase input-output governance whose roots are correlated to environmental and occupational hazards. Limit the impact of water and waste management on fish and so benefit the fishing community occupations. Control over the income and assets of equipment providers, ultimately reversing control of the value chain currently held by the high-income agents, namely the final sellers. Secondly, a collective method looking at disrupting the accumulation risk cycles, which could be supported by the government and FEDARP. The scale of the project ought to be extended from workers to community leaders and spatially from Portee to Rokupa, from formal to informal settlement and finally to neighboring fishing and non-fishing communities in Freetown to increase transparency across occupations and collective action, which is the long-term goal our strategy puts forward. To move forward and meet our strategy requirements based on 3 flows analyzed, we suggest research governance over input-output flows of the value chain, analyze connection between fish yield and water and waste management, understand per occupation savings to empower the most vulnerable categories. Finally, by researching networks, livelihoods and efficient saving schemes following our 3 cycles, implementing our suggestions to further enhance capacity to cope, prevent and mitigate risk can disrupt risk accumulation cycles.
Thank you.